Welcome back. In the last video, we talked about what FPV Cinelifters are and why they exist. Today, we're going to look at some of the different cameras that you could put on a Cinelifter. But before we get into cameras, I want to offer a quick disclaimer. If you're new to FPV, then Cinelifters are not a good place to start. Bigger drones are inherently more dangerous than smaller ones, and FPV flying is notoriously tricky. You need to be really confident in your skills as a pilot before you go anywhere near one of these, or you could seriously hurt yourself or somebody else. Fortunately, there are a ton of great resources and tutorials available on how to get started with FPV flying. I'll put some links in the description. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's go camera shopping. If we're shopping for a dedicated Cinelifter camera, then there are a lot of specs that we can totally ignore, like autofocus, built-in displays, audio features, and ergonomics. We can't use any of that stuff while the camera's flying through the air. But if you want to use this same camera for other non-drone filming as well, then you'll need to factor in those considerations on your own. There's also one feature that we probably want to avoid, and that's in-body image stabilization, or IBIS. A lot of mirrorless cameras have this feature, and it works by moving the sensor around inside the camera body to cancel out vibrations and record smoother footage. IBIS can work wonders for handheld shots, but unfortunately it does not work well for FPV footage, and it usually makes things worse, not better. So okay, maybe you're thinking if IBIS is no good for FPV, no problem, I'll just turn it off. Unfortunately, if a camera has an IBIS mechanism, then the sensor inside that camera can jiggle around during flight and ruin your shots even if you have IBIS disabled, because the sensor is not locked down to the camera. It's actually mounted on magnets, and those magnets can slip around even when IBIS is turned off in the settings. Now, depending on how you fly, you might be able to get away with using an IBIS camera on an FPV Cinelifter if you only fly slow and smooth. But there's always the possibility that that IBIS mechanism could let go and ruin your shot. And for that reason, as far as I'm concerned, all IBIS cameras are off the list for FPV. That means no Sony A7S III, no Panasonic S1H, and no Canon R5. Even though those cameras look great on paper, they all have IBIS. Okay, now that we know what won't work, let's take a look at what will work. This is not going to be any kind of in-depth camera review. My goal is just to give you a quick overview of some cameras that have the potential to work well for a Cinelifter build. There's also a lot to cover, so I'm going to be rattling off specs pretty quickly, but I'm going to put all this info into a spreadsheet as well, and I'll put a link to that in the description. First up, we've got the cheapest and lightest cameras that I would consider putting on a Cinelifter, the Sony A6 series. Stay away from the A6500 and A6600, they have IBIS, but the 6400 and lower have fixed sensors. They're definitely not the best cameras on this list, and they only shoot video at up to 30 frames per second in 4K, but you can pick one up for under $1,000 and they only weigh around 400 grams. Next, we've got the Blackmagic design Pocket Cinema cameras. There's a 4K version and a 6K version, and they're both strong contenders. The Blackmagic Pocket cameras have a really unusual design, but if you can get past the goofy exterior, these cameras offer superb image quality at a crazy low price because you're not paying for features you don't need, like fancy autofocus or IBIS. They also have dual native ISO and can record raw video internally at up to 60 frames per second. The Blackmagic Pocket 4K has a micro four thirds sensor, costs $1,300 and weighs 680 grams. The 6K version has a Super 35 sensor, goes for $2,000 and weighs 900 grams. Next on the list, we have the Panasonic GH5S and BGH1, which are basically the same guts in different cases. These guys have really similar specs to the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, but they both cost more. And unlike the Blackmagics, the Panasonics can't record raw video internally. The GH5S costs $1,800 and weighs in at 660 grams, and the BGH1 costs $2,000 and weighs 545 grams. Okay, the Sigma FP crams a full-frame 35mm sensor and uncompressed raw video recording into a tiny little body, and it also has incredible low light performance. But it can't go over 30 frames per second in 4K, and I've heard the menu system and raw workflow are an absolute nightmare. The Sigma FP costs $1,800 and it only weighs 422 grams, but remember that you're going to need to put a full-frame lens in front of it, and those tend to be heavier than micro four thirds and APS-C lenses. Next up, we've got the Zcam line of box cameras. I've never used one of these, but they definitely check a lot of the boxes we're looking for. No IBIS, great form factor, and from what I've seen, they're capable of producing some really great looking footage. I have heard from Zcam owners that Zcam's raw video format is kind of a pain to work with, but it's definitely worth taking a look at the Zcam lineup. On the low end, there's the Zcam E2C, which is one of the cheapest cameras on this list at only $800, and it only weighs 668 grams. But it can only shoot 4K at 30 frames per second, and I really like shooting 4K at higher frame rates for slow motion. The next step up in the Zcam line is the E2M4, which can shoot 4K at a whopping 160 frames per second for only $1,500. If I didn't already have the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, I would be very tempted to go for the Zcam E2M4 instead, since the Blackmagic 4K tops out at 60 frames per second in 4K mode. And then there are like a dozen other Zcam models going all the way up to the Zcam E2F8, which has a full-frame 8K sensor and costs $6,000. The Zcams weigh anywhere from 700 grams to just over a kilo, but we gotta move on. The Fujifilm XT3 is another possibility since it doesn't have IBIS like the newer T4. It shoots 4K at 60 frames per second, but it has a larger APS-C size sensor than most of the other 4K cameras we've looked at. It's also one of the lighter cameras on the list at only 539 grams. But there aren't a ton of lenses available for Fuji X-mount, and at $1,500, I think I'd rather have the Zcam E2M4 with its 160 frames per second super slow-mo in 4K. And last, but definitely not least, is the Red Komodo. I haven't had a chance to play with one of these yet, but I have used other Red cameras like the Raven and Gemini, and they are amazing. They're also very expensive. The Komodo has a 6K Super 35 size sensor and it costs $6,000. It also has a global shutter, so you don't get any rolling shutter distortion, which can be a big problem when you're moving cameras around fast like we do on FPV drones. I would expect Red's sensor and color science to beat every other camera on this list in terms of pure image quality, but I was a little disappointed to see that the Komodo tops out at 50 frames per second in 6K or 60 frames per second in 4K mode. For 6Gs, I would have loved to see at least 120 frames per second at 4K, but this still looks like an amazing camera and I definitely want one. The Komodo weighs in at a robust 953 grams. There are lots of other interesting cameras that I'm not going to cover here, like the FreeFly Wave, which can record an absolutely insane 420 frames per second in 4K, and people are flying even bigger cinema cameras like full-size Red DSMC2 cameras and the Alexa Mini, but at that point you're getting into 5 figures for the camera alone. And there are cheaper cameras you could try too, but once you go lower than the Sony A6 series, I'm not sure if the image quality would be worth going through the trouble of a Cinelifter build. At that point, I might just stick with the GoPro. So, to sum it all up, for a DIY Cinelifter build, I think the Blackmagic Pockets, the Fujifilm XT3, and the Zcam E2M4 sit right in the sweet spot in terms of price, performance, and weight. But if you have the budget for it, the Red Komodo and the higher-end Zcams look awesome. One final note about cameras, it's fun to geek out about specs, but all these cameras and drones are just tools for visual storytelling, and the story you're telling is what's really important, not the tools. It never hurts to use the best stuff you can get, but it's so much more important to spend the time learning how to use your camera well. But that's going to be it for this video. What do you think? Did I miss any good Cinelifter camera options? Let me know in the comments. In the next video, we're going to talk about lenses, so please subscribe and ring the bell so you'll know as soon as that video comes out. Cheers!